Hey guys, tonight we begin with the not-so-heroic, surprisingly short, and thoroughly exhausting lives of medieval knights. Those armored figures we usually picture on horseback, galloping into glory, swords raised, banners flying. But behind the shining armor was a very different truth. Because while legends claim they lived with honor, the reality is most didn't live very long at all. In fact, hitting 30 was a milestone. Hitting 40 was a miracle. And if you ever met a 50-year-old knight, you were either in church or standing next to a tombstone. So, before you sit back, go ahead and like the video if you enjoy these kinds of slow and oddly specific dives into history. And maybe let me know in the comments what temperature it is where you are, or what medieval job you think you'd survive best in. I'd like to believe I'd be a librarian, one without books, just quietly telling people to stop touching scrolls. Now dim the lights, maybe light a candle if you're feeling atmospheric, and let's ride slowly into the brutal, beautiful, and short-lived world of the medieval knight. Let's start with the obvious. Medieval knights were warriors, not part-time, not ceremonial, not just there for parades. Real knights trained, fought, and bled. From the moment they could walk, noble sons were taught how to hold a sword, fall off a horse, and get back up without crying. At 7, they were sent to another noble's household to serve as a page. That meant running errands, learning manners, and mostly getting yelled at for dropping things. At 14, they became squires, which was a fancy way of saying they did everything except actually wear the armor. They cleaned it, carried it, polished it, and watched as someone else got stabbed while wearing it. By 21, if they were lucky and still alive, they were dubbed knights, a process that often involved kneeling, praying, and then standing up into a life of constant violence. There were no desk jobs, no safe deployments, just a cycle of wars, feuds, crusades, and tournaments. The armor didn't protect them from everything, and often it was the armor that made dying more complicated. Heavy, suffocating, and expensive, it could turn a fall into a death sentence. And that was just the start of their problems, because knights didn't just fight. They also got hurt. A lot. Think broken bones, concussions, infected wounds, and teeth knocked out with the handle of a mace. There were no antibiotics, no sterile tools, no real doctors, just leeches, prayers, and a guy with shaky hands who thought bloodletting fixed everything. Even a simple cut could kill you if it got infected, and it often did. The average knight spent as much time healing as he did training, and if you were lucky enough to survive battle, you still had to survive recovery, which sometimes meant losing a limb, or worse, keeping it. Let's talk about food, because for all their reputation, knights didn't eat like kings. Unless they were at court, most meals were bread, cheese, maybe salted meat, and a thin ale to wash it down. Fresh vegetables were rare. Clean water was rarer. And while feasts looked impressive, they were occasional, not daily. Malnutrition was real. So was dysentery. So was scurvy. You could spend months on campaign eating hard biscuits and praying the local river didn't give you worms. Spoiler, it usually did. Then there was the lifestyle. Constant travel, sleeping in cold tents, and trusting that your squire didn't forget to dry your boots after the last rainstorm. Wet boots meant blisters. Blisters meant infection. Infection meant, well, you know where this is going. A knight's life wasn't luxurious. It was muddy, cold, and constantly bruised. You didn't ride off into the sunset. You limped into the next village, hoping someone had bandages and maybe a decent bowl of stew. And if you think tournaments were better, think again. Those were less sport and more carefully arranged injury festivals. Yes, they looked glorious. Yes, there were banners and ladies watching. But the jousting field was a minefield of concussions, broken jaws, and fractured spines. People died. Not often, but often enough that every knight knew the risk. And they still signed up because tournaments meant glory. And sometimes glory meant getting noticed by someone rich enough to offer you a real job, or at least a warmer cloak. Even peace wasn't safe. Knights had enemies, rival lords, angry peasants, jealous squires, or just bad luck. One wrong word at a feast could start a feud. One unpaid debt could lead to a midnight stabbing, and one ill-timed hunting trip could end with a broken neck and a story about how he fell trying to catch a particularly bold rabbit. So yes, they died young. 30 was old. 35 meant you probably owned land, a manor, and at least one ghost story about that time your horse threw you into a moat. But surviving that long wasn't just about skill. It was about luck, and not the good kind. The kind that let you dodge an arrow, avoid plague, and not drink from the wrong well. Most didn't make it, and for those that did, well, we'll get to them later, because their story isn't one of triumph. It's one of slow decline, aching joints, and realizing that the sword you once swung now feels like a bag of rocks. But before that, let's stay a little longer in the field. The mud is fresh, the armor is heavy, and the sunset, well, it's going down faster than you expected. Now, let's talk about what really made knights age faster than they should have. It wasn't just battles or bad food, it was the weight of everything they carried. And I don't just mean swords and shields. I mean the weight of duty, expectation, and the sheer pressure of being everyone's idea of a walking legend. Because when your entire life is built around the idea of honor and loyalty, it gets very hard to admit that you're cold, tired, and honestly just want to take a nap. Knights were expected to be brave, noble, generous, and utterly fearless. They were supposed to fight for the weak, defend the church, serve their lord, and do it all while wearing 30 kilograms of steel. The truth is, most of them were scared. Not always, but often enough, and they couldn't show it, because fear, like failure, wasn't part of the knightly code. You couldn't say no to a duel. You couldn't cry when your best friend died. You couldn't even hesitate when you were told to charge into a wall of spears. You just nodded, said your prayers, and hoped the armor wouldn't pinch too badly on the way down. Speaking of armor, let's clear up a myth. It wasn't impossible to move in. You could run, climb stairs, even fight fairly well. But it was exhausting. You sweat constantly. You overheated in the summer and froze in the winter. And once it got damaged, it didn't protect much. Dents made joints stiff. Loose straps meant exposed flesh. And repairing it was expensive, not to mention the smell. After 3 days on campaign, your armor didn't shine. It dripped. And no, not with water. With a mix of sweat, grime, and something that might have once been soup, and even when you weren't wearing it, you were thinking about it, worrying about rust, about stolen pieces, about whether the guy who fixed your helmet tightened the rivets or just smiled and lied. Armor wasn't a symbol. It was a burden, and that burden wore you down, not just your body, but your soul. Every scratch reminded you that you weren't invincible. You were just metal on the outside and very soft on the inside. Now, let's talk about horses. Yes, knights had them, big ones, trained war horses that could trample enemies and look majestic in paintings. But horses were living things. They got tired, they got sick, they ran away, and sometimes they just decided they didn't feel like charging into battle today. A well-trained destrier was worth more than some small castles, but it still had hooves, moods, and a tendency to panic at the worst possible moment. And when it did, it wasn't the horse that got stabbed. It was the guy strapped to the saddle. And horses needed food, care, shoes, and grooming. You didn't just ride them, you maintained them. Or, more accurately, your squire did. Unless your squire died. Then you did it, along with fixing your armor, sharpening your sword, finding water, setting camp, and trying not to cry when you realized you left your only dry cloak at the last village. Being a knight meant multitasking, all the time, and most of that multitasking involved trying not to die of something dumb. Now imagine doing all of this on a march, walking for miles every day, in heat, in rain, across mud, snow, and sometimes even frozen rivers, eating stale bread, sleeping under a tarp if you had one, waking up with your sword hand numb and your knee throbbing from that one injury you never really recovered from. You didn't get medical leave. You didn't get rest days. You just kept going, because if you didn't, someone else took your place. And in the medieval world, losing your place meant losing your future. Let's not forget disease. You could avoid arrows. You could dodge spears, but you couldn't dodge fleas, or lice, or the mysterious rash that spread through camp and made half the men walk funny. Hygiene wasn't non-existent, but it wasn't great either. Shared water, shared tents, and shared everything else meant that once one person got sick, everyone did. And medicine? If someone handed you a potion, it was probably wine mixed with herbs and a prayer. Sometimes it worked. Usually it didn't. And while we're here, let's talk about the mind, because constant battle, loss, and pressure didn't just hurt your body. It chipped away at your thoughts. Knights didn't talk about feelings. There was no word for trauma, but it was there, quiet, heavy, following them like a shadow. You didn't sleep well after a massacre. You didn't feel normal after watching a friend's head get crushed. But you were expected to act like it didn't matter, because pain was weakness. And weakness got you mocked, replaced, or quietly buried without a name. Knights weren't superheroes. They were men, some barely more than boys, thrown into a life of steel and blood because someone told them it was noble. And many of them believed it, at first, until the wounds stopped healing fast, until the laughter got quieter, until the dreams turned into memories they couldn't shake. And by then, it was too late to turn back, because if you stop being a knight, you stop being anything. And we haven't even touched on the politics yet, the backstabbing, the lies, the impossible choices between loyalty and survival. But we'll get there. For now, just imagine the cold, the weight, and the silence after battle, when the shouting stops and you realize you're still alive, but not quite the same. Let's look at the part of a knight's life that doesn't get carved into stained glass, the waiting. Because for every moment of heroic battle or dangerous duel, there were weeks of boredom. And that kind of boredom wasn't peaceful. It was tense, heavy, and soaked with the kind of silence that made men either drink too much or sharpen their blades for the third time that morning. Knights didn't always fight, but they were always preparing to, which meant they lived in a state of constant readiness, and that wears on a person in ways that don't show until years later. When you weren't on campaign, you were stationed somewhere, maybe in a drafty castle with mold in the corners and more rats than people, maybe guarding a bridge that nobody ever crossed, or standing watch over a lord who barely remembered your name. And during that time, you had one job: stay alert, stay useful, stay quiet. But humans aren't built for stillness, especially not those trained for action. So the mind starts turning in circles. Old injuries ache more, memories crawl back, and the days stretch like cold leather that never quite fits. You trained every day, even when it hurt. You rode horses, practiced with your sword, kept your gear in order, and waited. Because if you didn't stay ready, the next fight would be your last. No one cared if your wrist still ached from the last battle. You were expected to perform. And if you couldn't, well, there was always a younger man eager to take your place. Someone stronger, someone without a limp. The cycle never stopped, and neither could you. Then there was politics. Being a knight wasn't just about swinging a sword. It was about navigating power. You had to keep your lord happy, show up at the right feasts, laugh at the right jokes, and never, ever insult the wrong person's hunting dog. Because one poorly timed comment could mean exile, or worse, reassignment. No knight wanted to be posted in the marshlands. It was cold, damp, and full of angry insects. But one feud with the steward's nephew, and suddenly you were guarding sheep from imaginary bandits. You also had to manage rivalries. Other knights didn't always see you as a comrade. Sometimes they saw you as competition, especially if you were skilled, good with words, or just happened to survive more battles than seemed fair. Envy grew fast, and it didn't always end with words. There were accidents, broken reins, blunted blades during practice that somehow still split skin. And if you complained, you looked weak. So you didn't. You kept your eyes open, your back to the wall, and your sword close, even at dinner. Now let's talk about love, or the lack of it. Some knights married, many didn't. And even when they did, love wasn't always part of the arrangement. Marriages were political, designed to strengthen alliances or inherit land. You might be 28 and married off to a girl of 13 who cried every time you entered the room. Or you might be promised to someone noble and cruel, someone who saw you as a trophy, not a person. Either way, the result was often the same: cold beds, awkward dinners, and two people who barely spoke unless the steward was listening. For those without titles, marriage was even harder. You could serve loyally for years and still be denied a wife because your family wasn't important enough. Love was seen as a distraction, something for minstrels to sing about, not something for men with duty. So, you took comfort where you could, in brief glances, fleeting touches, or the quiet kindness of someone who brought extra bread when they didn't have to. And even those moments could vanish overnight. A reassignment, a raid, a rumor, and the person who made you feel human again disappeared like smoke in a winter field. And yet, despite all of it, you endured. Because what else could you do? You weren't trained to farm. You didn't know how to weave cloth or keep books. You were a knight. That was your title, your skill, and your curse. Leaving wasn't simple. It meant shame, poverty, and sometimes punishment. You couldn't just walk away, not unless you were ready to live as a beggar. And even then, the scars on your hands told everyone who you used to be. Some tried to retire. They bought land, built small homes, raised families, but they never really rested. The habits didn't fade. They still woke early, still checked the door 3 times before bed, still kept a dagger under the straw mattress, because the world didn't forget them, and they didn't forget the world. Old enemies didn't disappear. Old fears didn't shrink. And sometimes the peace was worse than the war, because in the quiet, the past got loud. But most didn't retire. They died on the road, in battle, from fever, or from a wound that festered when no one was watching. Some were buried in shallow graves by strangers. Others were lost in mud, their names never written down. A few were honored. Songs were sung, but those were the exceptions. Most were forgotten before their swords cooled, because history has room for legends, but not always for the men behind them. And that's what we're trying to fix, just a little, by remembering the real weight behind the armor. Not just the steel, but the silence, the loneliness, and the slow erosion of the self beneath the title. The knight was a symbol, but the man, he was flesh and bone, and he didn't always get a happy ending. Now let's talk about faith, because no matter how much steel you wore or how fast you could swing a blade, death was always close. And when death is that close, every day, you start looking for answers, or at least for meaning. Knights were expected to be devout, loyal to the church, obedient to its rules, ready to fight in its name. But belief isn't always simple, especially when you've seen what a battlefield looks like after sunrise, especially when the man you killed looked a little too much like someone you used to know. Religion in the Middle Ages wasn't just about prayer. It was about order. You paid tithes. You followed rituals. You confessed your sins, even if you weren't sure which ones counted. You attended Mass, even when your knee hurt from the last campaign. And you prayed. A lot. Before battles, after battles, sometimes during battles, when you were lying on the ground trying to figure out if the blood on your hands was yours. The church promised salvation, but it didn't promise peace. And for knights, that mattered, because how do you balance a sword in one hand and a Bible in the other? You're told not to kill, but then you're told to kill for God. You're told to be humble, but your entire identity depends on reputation. You're told to be pure, but half the men you fight beside visit brothels more often than they visit chapels. The contradictions piled up like armor on tired shoulders, and most knights carried them in silence. Some tried to reconcile it. They joined military orders, became Templars, Hospitallers, or Teutonic Knights. They fought for faith directly. They took vows, wore crosses, lived by strict codes. And for some, it worked. It gave them structure, purpose, a sense that their suffering had meaning. But even then, the doubts crept in, because whether you were fighting in the Holy Land or patrolling a cold northern fortress, blood still stained the ground the same color, and the cries of the dying didn't care what banner you carried. Others took a more personal approach. They carried relics, small bones of saints, bits of cloth touched to holy places, tiny icons hidden beneath their tunics, not because they were superstitious, but because they were desperate. Desperate for some kind of shield the armor couldn't provide, desperate for comfort when the fever came or the wound wouldn't stop bleeding. It wasn't about spectacle. It was about survival of the soul, not just the body. Confession was important, but it wasn't always easy. A knight might go months without seeing a priest, and when he did, what was he supposed to say? "Forgive me, Father, for I have sinned. I've killed 12 men, 2 horses, and maybe a monk. I'm not sure. It was dark." The church offered forgiveness, but not always understanding. And so many knights learned to keep quiet, to confess only the acceptable sins, to hide the rest behind polite nods and practiced piety. Pilgrimage was another path. If you survived long enough and had enough coin, you might travel to Rome, to Santiago, to Jerusalem, walk hundreds of miles barefoot through rain and hunger, just to kneel at a shrine and hope that it counted for something. For some, it was cleansing. For others, it was just another march, another journey with no battle at the end, only silence, and maybe, if they were lucky, peace. But faith wasn't just about ritual. It shaped how knights saw the world. They believed in heaven and hell, in angels and demons, in signs, omens, and dreams. A sudden storm could mean divine disapproval. A bird flying left instead of right could delay an entire campaign. The line between belief and fear was thin, and most walked it every day. They also believed in curses, in haunted weapons, in ancient sins passed down through blood. A knight who kept losing battles might blame a forgotten ancestor. A sword that never struck true might be buried in unconfessed guilt. And while these ideas weren't written in any holy book, they lived in the minds of men who had nothing but violence in their hands and silence in their hearts. And when a knight died, the rituals returned. A mass, a blessing, a burial if there was time. If not, a shallow grave and a hurried prayer. No monument, no choir, just earth and memory. And maybe, just maybe, someone would light a candle later, whisper a name, pretend that all the blood had been for something more than a lord's ambition. Because in the end, faith wasn't just about God. It was about hope. Hope that the pain meant something, that the suffering had purpose, that the years spent in mud and fire weren't just wasted echoes in a forgotten age. Knights didn't always understand their own beliefs, but they needed them, like armor for the soul, imperfect, heavy, but better than nothing. And maybe that's why they kept fighting, not just for glory, not just for land, but for the chance that somewhere, Beyond the veil of smoke and steel, there was rest, and maybe someone waiting with open arms. Not a squire, not a king, but something quieter, something eternal. Let's imagine you made it. Somehow you survived the battles, the winters, the betrayals, and the slow rot of old wounds. You're older now, not just in age, but in the way your bones protest every time you stand up. You've outlived friends, enemies, and even your own usefulness. There's no celebration, no reward, just a quieter kind of exhaustion, the kind that settles into your hands and stays there. Your armor doesn't fit the way it used to. The straps dig differently, the joints complain, and your sword feels heavier, not because it changed, but because you did. You don't train anymore. Not really. You just go through the motions. Swing once, twice, rest, then sit down and wonder when you stopped caring whether the blade was sharp. The castle is smaller now. Or maybe you've just seen too much to be impressed by stone walls and banners. The young squires run past you in the corridors. They don't nod. They barely glance. You're not a hero. You're a shadow, a reminder of what happens when you survive too long. They laugh louder than you remember. They walk taller. But they don't look over their shoulders as much. Not yet. People still call you sir, but the respect is thin, decorative, like an old sword above the hearth that no one touches. The new lord doesn't ask your advice. The steward forgets your rations, and the healer no longer brings herbs for your knees. You're expected to be quiet now, to sit and watch, to stay out of the way. Some of your peers took to farming, grew onions, raised chickens. One even opened a mill. But you never quite figured out how to hold a hoe without looking like you were about to fight it. Your hands remember reins and hilts, not seeds, not ropes, not baskets. The land doesn't speak to you, not like the battlefield did. So you wander, from village to village, from cold beds to quiet fires. Sometimes people offer you food. Sometimes they don't. A few recognize the crest on your shield, faded and chipped. Most just see an old man with a limp and a sword that hasn't seen oil in months. You say little. You ask for less. Your stories, the real ones, stay locked behind your teeth. You've told a few in taverns, once, maybe twice. They never landed the way you expected. People laughed at the wrong parts, or looked at you like you just recited a grocery list. So now you tell different stories, softer ones with jokes and small victories, ones where no one dies screaming. You think about those who didn't make it, faces without names, names without faces. Sometimes they come back to you at night, not in nightmares, in stillness. You see their last moments, hear their voices, not accusing, just there, like smoke in a room with no windows. You've tried to pray again, tried to believe that the years of killing were balanced by moments of mercy. You remember letting that boy go in the orchard. You remember pulling your comrade out of the fire. You hope those things matter. You hope they count, even if no one saw. The world moved on without you. The flags changed. The king died. His son wears a crown now, and you can't remember his face. There's talk of new lands, of ships crossing oceans, of guns replacing swords. You try to care. You fail. You sit by the hearth, stare at the flame, and wonder when warmth became a stranger. Sometimes you catch yourself reaching for your sword when you hear a sudden noise. Reflex, like a heartbeat, like a cough. You're not afraid. You just don't trust silence. Not after years of learning how quickly it ends. And when the younger men come to you, asking for advice, you pause. Because what do you say? Train hard, be loyal, don't flinch when the blade comes? Or do you say the truth? That none of it matters if you don't make it to 30. That glory fades faster than bruises. That the songs they sing are short and wrong. But you don't say any of that. You tell them to sharpen their swords, to watch their footing, to keep their backs to the wind. And when they leave, laughing, you sit quietly, and you remember the time someone told you the same things, and how you didn't listen either. You've kept some things, a coin from the East, a ring from a woman you can't name, a scrap of cloth that once carried your crest. Small things, pointless, maybe, but they remind you that you were real once, that your hands once held more than aches. And now, with your sword rusting and your stories fading, you wonder if that was enough, if being a knight ever truly meant anything, or if it was just another name for someone who didn't know when to stop. Sometimes in the quiet, you remember the sound of banners in the wind, not loud, just there, like the breath of a memory. You remember the weight of your sword across your lap, the way your gauntlets left marks on your palms, the pressure of the saddle after a long ride. These are the details that never made it into the songs, but they're the ones that stayed. There's a hill not far from where you sleep now. Grass grows tall. The stones lean to one side. Some names are still readable. Most aren't. It's not a proper cemetery. Just a place where people started leaving the dead when no one had time for funerals. You go there sometimes, not for mourning, just to sit. The wind there is calm. The birds don't seem afraid, and for a few minutes you can pretend that nothing ever burned. You don't speak to the dead, but you let them be near, in the rustle of the grass, in the creak of your knees as you kneel. And sometimes when the clouds pass slowly overhead, you think you hear laughter, not from ghosts, just from the past, from evenings when the fire was warm and the wine was good and someone told a story badly, but no one cared. You still keep your armor. What's left of it? A dented breastplate, a cracked helm, a pair of boots that haven't fit in years. You don't wear them. You just keep them near, like old tools, like memories you don't need anymore but can't throw away. You've thought about burying them, giving them back to the earth, but not yet, not quite. Some nights you dream. The dreams aren't clear, faces blur, voices drift, but the feelings are sharp. Pride, fear, that deep breath before the charge, the sharp jolt when steel hits shield, the silence that comes when everything ends and you're still standing. You wake slowly, blink at the rafters, and wonder why your hands still ache. They say nights were made for glory, but you know better. Nights were made for silence, for long roads, for moments no one else remembers. They were made for holding the line when no one else could, and for walking away when no one else would. They were made for fading, not shining, for falling, not flying. The books got it wrong. It wasn't about chivalry or honor. It was about endurance. Getting up when your legs said no, moving forward when your friends were gone, smiling at lords who didn't know your name, and still finding a way to keep going, not because you believed in the cause, but because the road didn't offer a turn. But now the road is quiet. The wars are over. The swords are cold, and your body, tired as it is, feels heavy in the best way, like it's settling, like it's finally allowed to rest. You don't need to watch the door anymore. Don't need to check the sky. There's no march in the morning, no feast to guard, no duel waiting on the edge of the field. Tonight, you breathe easy. The fire is low, the blanket warm, the world outside can wait. You're not a knight now. You're just a man with sore knees, a crooked back, and stories no one remembers quite right. And that's fine. That's enough. Because not every hero gets a statue. Some just get peace, a soft bed, a quiet room, a slow exhale, and the gentle knowledge that they made it farther than they ever thought they would. You close your eyes. The wind outside hums gently. Somewhere in the distance, a bell rings once and then stops. The past curls beside you like a familiar dog. No armor, no pain, just stillness and sleep. And maybe, just maybe, tomorrow will come slowly, with sunlight, with birdsong, with nothing to do but breathe